Now, what sometimes are called the data caching objects are the objects that are used to work with data in a disconnected state. This is that set of objects that's over on the right side of our chart. And these are the objects that you're going to use for viewing, editing, filtering, sorting, and transporting the data around without having to be connected to the database. So you can retrieve data into one of these objects, like a data table, and you can have multiple data tables in a data set. And you'll see that you can also create relationships between the tables in a data set. And then you can make changes to the data, you can sort the data, and so on. And when you're ready, you can then push those changes, if necessary, back to the database by going through a data adapter. And so you see the arrow that connects the things over on the right there with the data adapter on the left. And in addition, these objects, the data set and the data table, provide very easy conversion back and forth to and from XML. So you can load up data from XML into a data set or a data table, and you can write data out as XML from a data set or a data table, making it very easy to communicate your data back and forth between various components. The objects that are part of this disconnected group are the data set, which you see as sort of the big box around everything. And data sets you can think of as being sort of a disconnected version of a database, in that a data set can have multiple different data tables in it. Now, each of these data tables, which is in a data table collection in the data set, has data rows storing all of the data columns with the schema information, like the names of the columns, their data types, and various properties of the columns. And also, the data tables have a set of constraints, like unique constraints and foreign key constraints that apply to those tables. In addition to data tables, the data set contains a collection of data relations. And although you can have foreign key constraints for a data table, that's actually separate in ADO.NET from having data relations. In other words, you can define a relationship between two tables without necessarily enforcing a foreign key constraint between the tables. And you can use those relationships between the tables, for example, to navigate from one table to another, to find child rows or a parent row, without necessarily enforcing the fact that there has to be a parent row for every child row. And in many ways, these data relations are used to mirror the nested hierarchies that exist in XML documents, and they also are used to generate nested XML documents. So you can read and write XML very easily. That's why you see the sort of double-headed arrow connecting these objects to XML, and you can read and write both the data as well as the schema. So you can write out the schema from a data table as XML. You can also create schema for a data table or for an entire data set as XML. And there's a special type of data set that you can create using XML schema, and that's called a typed data set. A typed data set is a data set based on a set of classes that are derived from the base classes for a data set. And these are generated for you automatically in Visual Studio, and you can do it yourself using a command line tool if you don't want to work with Visual Studio, based on an XML schema document. So you can define the schema for a set of tables using standard XML schema language, and you can also add some annotations for things that aren't part of the standard XML schema, things like primary keys and so on, or auto-incrementing columns. You can add these annotations to your XML schema, and then based on that, Visual Studio or this command line tool will create a set of classes for you that gives you strongly typed properties corresponding to the individual tables and the individual columns in the tables, and that also provides a set of methods so that, for example, instead of just calling the generic getRows, you would be able to, let's say, in a data set of categories and products, you'd be able to call getProducts. It would know that you're working with products, not just with any old type of row. So these are schema specific. And as I say, it's a set of classes, each type data set. It's not just a single class. It's a class corresponding to the data set as a whole that's derived from data set, but there are also classes corresponding to the individual data rows themselves. That would be, for example, a product row that knows that it has properties corresponding to the different columns in that product data table. And these properties and methods make it very convenient, safe, and performant to work with data sets and data tables in your applications. You're not required to use these type data sets. You can use generic data sets and data tables, but as you'll see, there are a lot of advantages that come from working with type data sets. In addition, there's an object that we didn't see in our chart called the data view. And data views are created based on data tables, but they add the ability to do filtering. They have a row filter property, sorting, and they also provide extended support for data binding. So, for example, in Windows Forms, data views are used to bind to the grids, for example, that would go on a Windows form. And you can very easily create a data view from a data table because every table has a default view associated with it. And then there's also something that was added in ADO.NET 2.0, and that's a data table reader. People really like the fast way of being able to stream data out of a database, and they wanted to be able to do that with the data in their data sets and data tables. So Microsoft provided a data table reader, which acts like a data reader, but the source of the data, instead of being in a database and requiring to use a .NET data provider, the source of the data for a data table reader is your disconnected data in a data table. So this is like a data reader for data tables and data sets, and it gives you that fast, forward-only way of reading the data, and it's also very resilient to adding or deleting rows while you're reading, more so than if you were just using for each to cycle through the rows in a data table.